If the nightmare scenario of World War III were to become reality, where would the hostilities break out? Could it come near the shores of the Baltic Sea, with Russia trying to regain some of its prestige in the region after an embarrassing performance in Ukraine? Could it be in the Middle East, with a renewed Iranian nuclear program? Or perhaps it could come from renewed hostilities on the Korean peninsula, which is still technically in a state of war. Or maybe China decides to risk everything on an invasion of Taiwan. These are all potential hotspots, but the likeliest one could be in the South China Sea, where China has expanded its military presence for a decade and alienated all of its neighbors in the region, who also claim these waters and their islands. Could World War III break out in the South China Sea? If so, why? Let's take a look at the importance of this region, the basis of China's territorial ambitions in it, and how likely a confrontation might actually be. The South China Sea, which stretches from the Strait of Malacca in the west to the Strait of Taiwan in the east, is a rich target for any would-be great power to exploit. It is abundant in resources. There are at least 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in these islands and waterways. The South China Sea is also home to some of the world's richest fisheries, providing about 15% of the world's total fishing potential. Rare earth metals such as yttrium, which are so vital to the modern digital economy, can also be found in the South China Sea. In addition to its natural resources, the area is one of the most vital crossroads of world trade. As of 2021, about $5.3 trillion, about 22% of annual global trade, passed through the South China Sea's shipping lanes, including 40% of the world's petroleum products, 60% of its maritime trade, and a third of the world's total shipping. Some of the world's biggest economies depend on this trade too. For example, 42% of Japan's total trade comes through this region. This is a rich prize for any aspiring superpower. When considering why China wants the South China Sea so badly, it is also important to note that it is a food insecure nation. It depends heavily on foreign food imports. In 2017, China imported $104.5 billion worth of food and exported only about $60 billion. In terms of grain production, Chinese agriculture has achieved a 1-to-1 production to consumption ratio. However, it lags behind its rivals like the United States and Australia, which produce 1.4 times more grain than they consume. Additionally, China's economic growth has created a large middle class, with more sophisticated food demands, such as meat and dairy, which are more resource-intensive. It needs to import from foreign sources to fulfill the demands of its population. It does not help that China has a relatively low amount of arable land at 0.21 acres per capita. Environmental damage from decades of communist mismanagement makes matters worse. 15.5% of China's groundwater is so polluted that it cannot be used in any setting, and widespread soil contamination has destroyed millions of acres of otherwise arable land, especially in the country's southern provinces. Meanwhile, over 1 million Chinese hogs were slaughtered to contain the spread of African swine fever, and domestic pork production fell by 21.3% in 2019. Meanwhile, pork imports from the United States increased by 258%. To make matters worse for Beijing, even though China is the world's largest producer and exporter of fish, it is also still the world's third largest fish importer, and Chinese fisheries have been stressed by overfishing. In 2013, the Chinese leadership acknowledged that the country would require moderate imports of food to meet its consumption needs. In this light, it is not surprising that China would want to increase its food security. Seizing the fisheries in the South China Sea is only the most obvious method of expansion of its food production capacity. Controlling the shipping that is so vital to its food supply is a no-brainer for Beijing. China also became the world's biggest energy consumer in 2010. In 2013, China became the world's largest net importer of crude oil, and its energy demands have only grown in the decade since. It must remain able to access the South China Sea's shipping lanes to ensure this energy supply. Bottom line, whoever controls the South China Sea also controls its resources and the economies of the nations that rely on the shipping that goes through its waters. It is therefore not surprising that China made moves to expand its influence in the region when its military became more capable. How has China justified these moves? Beijing cites historical reasons. Its modern claims on 90% of the South China Sea's waterways are based on the so-called 9-line map. The map originated in 1947 when, in the aftermath of World War II, a Chinese cartographer named Yang Huairen drew a map of 11 dashes, which extended from the waters east of Taiwan through the South China Sea almost to Malaysia and up the Vietnamese coastline all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin. This map was drawn under the nationalist government which ruled the then Republic of China. 2 years later, the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, overthrew the nationalists and took control of the Chinese mainland. Mao subsequently redrew the map to 9 dashes and abandoned the claim on the Gulf of Tonkin, but the basic scheme remained intact. China tries to justify the 9-line's legitimacy on historical grounds. It claims that it was the great power in the area and had run the waters before it suffered from unjust imperialism at the hands of the Western powers and Japan in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Records of Chinese control and development of the Spratly Islands in particular supposedly stretch back to the 2nd century BC. More concrete Chinese claims come from the Cairo and Potsdam declarations during and after World War II. These supposedly had China reclaiming sovereignty in the South China Sea's islands. The formal peace treaty with Japan in 1951 and the San Francisco Conference Statement in 1958 also had China reiterating that the South China Sea territory was its own. However, these claims were and are regarded as unfounded by the international community. The dispute in the South China Sea therefore gives credence to the realist theory of international relations, where self-interested states compete with one another in an anarchical environment. China's claim on the area are unrecognized, so it is asserting itself by force and daring anyone to try and stop its ambitions. After all, there is no policeman to call on in an international setting and no court of law with any real power beyond what states themselves give it, as we will soon see. The 11 and 9-line maps were of little consequence in the first few decades after they were drawn. China had suffered from nearly 150 years of invasion, civil war, and the famines and purges Mao imposed with the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. China was therefore in no position to enforce the claims of its 9-line. However, Beijing indicated early on that it was willing to use force to back up its otherwise spurious claims. In 1974, China seized control of the Paracel Islands from the then existing country of South Vietnam, killing more than 70 South Vietnamese troops in the process. The following year, the Vietnam War ended, and the country reunified under the North's rule, and the North inherited the claim to the Paracels, which it disputes with China to this day. The Paracels are relatively close to the Hainan Island, which is officially recognized Chinese territory. But as China got economically and militarily stronger after Mao's death in 1976, it got bolder in enforcing its claims further afield. In 1988, China and Vietnam fought in the Spratlys, and Vietnam again got the worst of the engagement, suffering the loss of 60 sailors and 3 ships. China also fought with the Philippines in the Mischief Reef incident of 1996, where 3 ships from the Chinese Navy fought a 90-minute battle with a Filipino gunboat in the Spratly Islands. However, China's modern posture in the South China Sea dates to 2012, when it unilaterally seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a territory in the Philippines recognized exclusive economic zone. Standoffs and warning shots between China and the Philippines had occurred in 2011, but the situation escalated dramatically in April 2012. On the 8th, a Filipino Navy surveillance plane spotted 8 Chinese fishing boats in the Scarborough Shoal. On the 11th, the Filipino Navy had a standoff with China's Navy. China eventually won this contest when, on July 18th, it blocked Filipino ships and fishing boats from entering the Scarborough Shoals lagoon. It has effectively administered the area ever since. The Philippines took China to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2013, and in 2016, the court ruled in the former's favor, dismissing any claim that China had over the territory in the South China Sea and invalidating the 9-line entirely. Did this stop China from advancing its claims in the area? You know the answer to that. Beijing's attitude was that the court made its ruling, good luck in enforcing it. China not only disregarded the international court's ruling, but it accelerated its plans to dominate the South China Sea. From 2013 to 15, it began building artificial islands in its positions in the Spratly Islands. It soon began militarizing these areas. In March 2022, US Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral John C. Aquilino announced that China had fully militarized at least 3 of the islands it had built several years earlier. These islands were Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. The new fortresses boasted airfields with fighter jets and which were even capable of hosting bombers. The islands also housed anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile systems. Laser and jamming equipment were also features in these islands. The military buildup came partially in response to the United States Freedom of Navigation Operations (FONOPs) in the area. These operations and China's response to them pose one of the biggest risks for war. In 2022, Aquilino was in the thick of the action. He spoke with the Associated Press reporters on a US Navy reconnaissance plane, a P-8A Poseidon, that flew close to the Chinese island fortresses. Chinese military personnel contacted the plane and warned it to leave. China has sovereignty over the Spratly Islands, as well as surrounding maritime areas. Stay away immediately to avoid misjudgment. The American pilot responded like so: "I am a sovereign, immune United States naval aircraft conducting lawful military activities beyond the national airspace of any coastal state. Exercising these rights is guaranteed by international law, and I am operating with due regard to the rights and duties of all states." The implication was obvious. China claims that the islands it built are its territory and that it has the right to defend them. The United States says that they are not, and proceed under the assumption that they are not. Maintaining freedom of trade and navigation on the world's waterways has long been one of the United States military's primary missions. To maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and deter China from growing even more aggressive there, the United States has conducted its FONOPs since 2015. These operations can take one of 2 forms. In the first form, they may simply be transit exercises. In the second, they may be explicit military exercises. The United States does not notify or seek China's approval when it conducts these operations within its supposed 9-line territory. In other words, the FONOPs are a direct challenge to China's claimed sovereignty in the South China Sea, showing that the United States regards these claims as nothing more than illegitimate bluster on the part of Beijing. This is a game of brinksmanship. Who will blink first? So far, it's been China, but there is no guarantee that that will continue forever. In its first FONOP on October 27, 2015, the destroyer USS Lassen came within 12 nautical miles of features in the Spratly Islands claimed by China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Although the FONOP was technically designed to counter all of these expansive territorial claims, everybody understood who the real recipient of the message was supposed to be. Similar operations have taken place since then, and they have increased as the years have gone by. The Chinese Navy soon challenged America's FONOPs, and there have been numerous close calls. In 2018, there was a near collision between a US Navy destroyer and a Chinese warship when the latter tried to block the American vessel's path. This close call was avoided, but Chinese naval ships have become more aggressive in tailing and disputing the US Navy as it sails past what they claim are Chinese territorial waters and islands. The risk for escalation increases when one considers that ship captains have a relatively high degree of autonomy. For example, equipment failure might make a captain feel like his vessel is under threat. Faulty communications, equipment, or radars could present an incomplete picture of events, giving the ship's captain what he believes are limited options to protect the vessel and its crew. In such confusion, human nature tends to default to assuming the worst. There is precedent for a close call between the US and Chinese armed forces. In April 2001, an American reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter and was forced to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island. China detained the plane's crew for 11 days as Washington and Beijing blamed each other for the incident and disagreed over the terms of a resolution. Both sides tried to be accommodating, and the incident was resolved without too much controversy in the end, to the point that it's nearly forgotten today. If a similar incident occurred now, the story could be very different. Understandably, this prospect makes military and foreign policy experts nervous. Some have called for an end to the US military's FONOPs in the South China Sea, arguing that they have failed and that the risks exceed the benefits. They argue that the cost of upholding international norms through military means has increased to a level that is too high and that the American public would not be willing to pay. Instead, these experts argue that the United States should use economic leverage to force China to change its behavior. There is recent precedent for this. In 2020, the United States Commerce Department sanctioned 24 Chinese companies for their behavior in the South China Sea, prohibiting the sale of certain exported goods. The State Department joined in the effort and announced that individuals in those companies would also be prohibited from obtaining visas to enter the United States. However, there are severe limits to this approach. Most of the companies in question did not source any of their materials from the United States, and the visa restrictions are altogether toothless. It's hard to conclude that completely ceding the military realm in the South China Sea to China's much less capable neighbors will encourage Beijing to alter its expansionist policy in the region. To add to these diplomatic and military tensions, there are also matters of national and cultural pride among the South China Sea's disputants. The 9-dash line has become a matter of national pride among the Chinese public over the last decade. To them, it is a sign that the period of humiliation, poverty, and revolution are over, and that China is at last retaking its rightful place at the hegemon of Asia. For China's neighbors, the issue is similarly sensitive. In the summer of 2023, Vietnam banned Barbie from its movie theaters over a scene with a map in the background that supposedly depicted China's 9-dash line. Vietnam and the Philippines banned the movie Uncharted in 2022 for the same reason. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia banned the 2019 movie Abominable, again for the same reason. For these countries, which also claim the South China Sea but do not have the military means to back up their assertions, sensitivity about their disadvantage is naturally elevated. With national pride on the line, there are additional emotional stakes in the South China Sea conflict. The United States, which is approaching the dispute from strategic and economic perspectives, will need to take such cultural considerations into account as it makes its policy there to counter China's hegemonic ambitions. The United States is keen to make alliances with other countries in the area to prevent China from taking control of the South China Sea's shipping lanes. This strategy began with the reinvigoration of the quadrilateral security dialogue during the Trump years. The United States and its Quad partners, Australia, Japan, and India, committed to maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. China has repeatedly protested the Quad and considers it a threat. Meanwhile, the United States has renewed its long-standing military ties with the Philippines and is building new army, air, and naval bases in that country. This is bad news for China, which was hoping to court the Philippines into its orbit. Despite the bitter South China Sea dispute, Rodrigo Duterte, who was president of the Philippines from 2016 to 22, maintained a friendlier policy toward China, in hopes of making his country less dependent on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has reversed this policy and allowed the US military a greater presence in the Philippines. The United States has also been steadily improving its bilateral relations with Vietnam. Although there are no formal military ties between the two countries yet, that could change in the future, as China continues to get more aggressive with its claims in the area. The United States has not taken the side of the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Vietnam, or any other power in the area with excessive maritime claims. Indeed, it does not support any of these and seeks to maintain freedom of navigation in the area. However, none of these countries have the ability to shut such navigation down. China does, and containing its ambitions in the South China Sea is the common interest that they all share. In possibly the most famous part of his History of the Peloponnesian War, the Melian Dialogue, the Athenians told the city of Melos that they had two choices: submit or suffer the consequences. In contrast to the Melians' talk about what would amount to international law today, the Athenians responded only that they had an interest in Melos and would be acting accordingly. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. We have seen this ancient dynamic in play in the South China Sea, with China acting in a similar manner, with China unlikely to change its behavior anytime soon, and with the economic, geostrategic, and cultural stakes involved, it's far from a stretch to think that war could break out in this region. Perhaps an American FONOP goes very wrong, or perhaps China uses its bases in the region to launch a much greater offensive in disputed territories. However it happens, the consequences would be catastrophic, and an accident here is much more likely than an accident over Taiwan. But what do you think about the South China Sea dispute? Is it the place where World War III is likeliest to break out? Is there a way to resolve the matter peacefully? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.